Good morning. I'm Nick Freudenberg. I teach public health here at the CUNY Graduate School of Public Health and Health Policy, and I'm also the director of the CUNY Urban Food Policy Institute. And we thank you all for coming this morning to what we think will be an important beginning of a discussion or continuation of a discussion. Food democracy is an idea, an aspiration, and a challenge. In a food democracy, people reclaim the power to shape their food environment, their diet, and their food system. Food democracy puts forth the vision that if every person had a voice in shaping how food is grown, distributed, sold, consumed, and disposed of, the results can be better health, less hunger and food insecurity, a more sustainable and equitable food system, and better prospects for the food workforce. Food democracy is not inevitable. It requires choices and individual and collective action. Food democracy is as American as apple pie and as radical as any idea advanced yet by the food justice movement. In the coming months and years, the CUNY Urban Food Policy Institute is committed to advancing, exploring, and we hope making real the concept of food democracy. And today's panel is a wonderful start to this initiative. Before introducing our speakers, let me pose some of the questions I hope they and all of us will be discussing today and in the months to come. First, how can we define a practice of food democracy that is both feasible and realistic, yet also visionary? What are good starting points for expanding food democracy in New York City right now? How can we connect efforts to strengthen food democracy to larger struggles for democracy, the movements for voters' rights, campaign finance reform, corporate accountability, racial equity, and so on? Who will be the opponents of stronger food democracy? And how can we counter efforts by giant food corporations, the ultra-wealthy, and others to maintain our current inequitable food system and the benefits it brings to those special interests? Let me tell you about the speakers who will help us to answer these questions. Phil Thompson is the Deputy Mayor for Strategic Policy Initiatives in New York City, Office of the Mayor. His work is not limited to local and regional government. In support of the Colombian peace process, he worked closely with the Colombian Ministry of Environment and local stakeholders to create sustainable environmental and community development programs. And he's also worked in many other cities in the United States and other countries to explore equity, democracy, and economic development. Our second speaker, Mark Winnie, is a senior advisor at the Center for a Livable Future at Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, and he's the co-founder of numerous organizations, including the Community Food Security Coalition, the State of Connecticut Food Policy Council, and the City of Santa Fe Food Policy Council. He's the author of 3 books. And our third speaker, Katie Parker, who's a senior research associate at the Democracy Collaborative and the editor of CommunityWealth.org. She works to advance strategies that build community wealth and democratize ownership and control. A primary focus has been on how anchor institutions can leverage their business practices, such as procurement, hiring, and investments, to support inclusive and democratic economic development. So just a few business items. At your tables is a survey we're taking as part of our new Food Democracy Initiative, where we want some of your ideas about food democracy. And we're asking you to fill it out before you leave today and return it to us or put it on the table. And we will try and synthesize your ideas, questions, suggestions as we continue working on this topic. Second, we want to tell you about our next forum, where we'll be talking about food safety in New York. Comprehensive report sometime later in March on the food safety system in New York City, how city, state, and federal government and businesses work together to ensure our food safety and what are some of the limitations of that system. So we hope many of you will be able to come. So I'm going to now turn it over to Phil Thompson, And I just wanted to list a couple of the questions that I'm hoping he will talk about. One is this concept of deep democracy that he has worked on. And second, we hope that you'll be able to talk some about some of the factors that challenge cities and mayors who want to deepen democracy to further address the inequities experienced by African American and other populations in New York and other cities. And with that, I turn it over. Thank you so much for being here.
Good morning. Come on, folks. Good morning. Okay. So let me just say, I don't think I've seen Nick for since we did the Empowerment Zone proposal in the early 90s, right? So it's great to see you again. And that was a crazy 10-week process we engaged in. We got to know each other under a lot of pressure at that time.
Right in this neighborhood.
Right in this neighborhood, absolutely. I want to, I guess, start with a personal note on my interest and encounters with food. Of course, food is the biggest drug, most powerful drug all of us take every day. But when I was in planning school at Hunter, I wrote my master's thesis on the impact of antibiotics in animal food feed on human health. And I was that was my master's thesis, but I was in an urban planning program, and this was in the mid-1980s, and I couldn't get a job. Like when I explained to people, well, I'm interested in, the effects of antibiotics in animal feed on human health, and I'm in New York City looking for a job, people look at me like, you're in the wrong place. This is New York. We don't give a shit about animal feed, essentially. So I said, okay, I'm going to do housing, affordable housing. I had no real training in affordable housing, but that's where the jobs were. And so I ended up doing housing. But it wasn't because I housing is the issue that makes me wake up at night, or whatever. I spent the first part of my childhood in inner city Philadelphia, and then I moved out to live with my grandparents in a rural area right near 3 Mile Island, where there was a nuclear meltdown. And all of us who lived in the area, and by the way, this was on Amish country also, so we got our food fresh from the Amish every Friday. All we knew was out there was pretty good food. But what happened, and the Amish don't use chemical fertilizers. So what happened after the 3 Mile Island spill was all of the cows started giving stillbirths. And Hershey's chocolate is near there, like the Hershey's plant in Hershey, PA, and they buy the milk from all of these farmers. And all of us in high school thought, oh, of course Hershey's is going to stop buying the milk, because obviously if all the cows are giving stillbirths, there's something going on with the milk. And of course this will be government will intervene or something, and they won't be able to make chocolate with this milk. And no, nothing happened. And my whole high school stopped eating Hershey's chocolate. I have not had a Hershey's chocolate bar since then. Because we were like, this stuff is radioactive, right? We're not going to do that. So anyhow, in the back of my head, I've always had this kind of interest in what the hell is going on with our food system. Because I lost trust in government, in corporations to really look after us. That was one. And the second thing is, my grandfather was from North Carolina and was raised during the Depression. He was in a forced labor camp in the 1920s where he was the cook. He was a horrible cook. And he just fried everything in fatback. I don't know if you know what that is, and everything. And he didn't believe in buying food from the supermarket if he could avoid it. So he would go out at night with his car and his high beams and hit rabbits, and then bring like a bunch of rabbits into the kitchen, skin the rabbits, and fry them in fatback with the head still on and the rabbit eye looking at you, and like serve that for dinner. If my grandmother wasn't around, it would just be fried rabbit and fatback. Or we'd go out at night with the dogs, chase a possum up a tree, catch a possum, put it in a cage for 2 weeks, feed it cabbage to improve the taste a little bit, or, and then eat the possum. And when I got to be 12 years old, I said, I'm going to learn how to make spaghetti and a hamburger, and I'm not going to do this other thing. But, I had this very personal, close association with food, because, yeah, I just, I had to get away from, some of this stuff. So, let me talk about deep democracy for a minute. To me, America has really been framed by two, there's some really great things in our history, such as the initial impulse in the revolutionary period to have a democracy, to form a nation guaranteeing equal rights for everyone, the inherent worth of everyone. Those were revolutionary ideals. Inspired the French Revolution, inspired the Haitian Revolution, inspired the Irish resistance against Britain, inspired the Civil War in the U.S. much later. Those were revolutionary ideals. But those ideals were always resisted from the very beginning. And I think the two grand false narratives that really undermine the initial revolutionary impulse of the American dream. One had to do with turning people into property. And that went against everything that the American Creed said and stated, the Declaration of Independence, turning people into property. And even at the time of the founding, the founders knew that was a lie. And the founders, you may be surprised to learn, believed in a shared economy. Even Hamilton, who was considered one of the more conservative founders, believed that workers who don't own land should own a piece of a company if they work at a company. Madison believed that. Jefferson believed that. Kosciuszko, the Polish immigrant, the bridge is named after, fierce abolitionist, also believed in a shared economy. Adam Smith thought that capitalism would prevent aristocracies, and the idea was to have wide distribution of property. That was the belief set. Who was opposed to it? Slave owners. Slave owners said, you can't have democracy extending into workplaces or into property relationships because we're slave owners. So that was the resistance. And the false narrative was that Africans really were not humans. They were not people. So you could make people into property. And of course, that's what led us to have a civil war. What happened during the Civil War? It's the biggest seizure of capital in the history of all revolutions, far surpassed the Russian Revolution. 4 million slaves freed, each slave worth in today's dollars probably a fancy Mercedes-Benz, $80,000 or more, and you free 4,000 of them. That was a huge taking of property. And the 13th Amendment said no more slavery or forms of servitude or labor that resemble slavery. This was an economic revolution, not just a revolution about freeing black people because they're black people. It was saying this is the wrong way to have, wrong kind of economy. Then came the 14th Amendment, which said that we're not going to let state governments re-enslave black people. We're going to make sure there are federal protections for all the former slaves. But what happened? Economic elites were threatened by the popular uprisings the Civil War gave rise to, by some of the experiments happening under the Reconstruction governments, and Northern industry actually worked with the defeated Confederates to put the Confederates back in power. Lincoln was assassinated by ex-Confederates. Tens of thousands of activists, black and white, were murdered across the South. Black folks couldn't vote for another 100 years. New Supreme Court put in power, a Union Army withdrawn from the South. New Supreme Court put into power. And what did this new Supreme Court do? Put in power under conditions of severe violent repression, stifling, crushing of democracy on the heels of the Civil War. What did they do? They said, oh, the 14th Amendment doesn't prohibit segregating black folks from white folks so that poor blacks, poor whites and blacks could not come together because literally they were going to physically separate them. 14th Amendment, no problem with that. But they said something else. They invented a term. They said corporations are legal persons. And the 14th Amendment should protect corporations, who were then afraid that state legislators would start making them pay for polluting the water, polluting the air, using roads for their own interest and not paying enough taxes and all of that. Corporations said, no, we are citizens just like any human being, and we deserve the protections of the 14th Amendment. And that was the basis of the recent Citizens United decision about 5 or 6 years ago that freed up all restrictions on corporate campaign financing, and it was just an empowerment move. But they've gone back to that over and over again. What is the big lie underneath of that? Well, first we said people are property, and then we said property are people. And that obviously is wrong. Corporations are the most powerful organizations ever invented, and to say they deserve the same protections as you or me, individual citizens, and there's no difference, is one of the biggest fantasies ever. But that is the kind of, and to say that the 14th Amendment intended to protect slaves is to protect corporations, it is just one of the most anti-democratic things imaginable. And that is still the basis of our law. So anti-democratic stuff is deep in our fabric. Now, let me say a few other things and wrap up. One, my dad was raised on a farm in the South, and one of the things that happened with electrification after World War II, the Tennessee Valley Authority and all of that, 5 southern states got their electricity. Guess who didn't get electricity? Black farmers. And that's why so many went bankrupt. That's why so many moved to New York City or Chicago or LA, because electrification went to white folks, not black folks. So when you start talking about democratizing the food system and the property system, it is deeply entrenched and embedded in our history of discrimination and race, and all of this stuff is very foundational to the things that we're talking about today. Now, most recently, I've engaged these issues in central Brooklyn, working for the last 5 years with a coalition of folks where we fought to save Interfaith Hospital and then fought with the state to and let the community pick the head of the hospital, and we picked Dr. LaRae Brown, first black woman head of a hospital in the history of New York State, and then won control of Brookdale Hospital and Kingsbrook Hospital, then fought for it with the governor, and he announced $1 billion plan, it's our plan, called Vital Brooklyn, and we're still fighting around that. But one of the things we got out of that process was money to train young people. So for the last several years, we did summer youth training programs around social determinants of health, and each year interviewed 700 residents in central Brooklyn asking, what do you think needs to happen to improve community health? What do you think the problems are? Nutrition food was way up on the list. But number one on the list, 77% said we have no leaders. 77% said we have no leaders. So that's the work. It's actually working with communities, building up leadership community by community. That's how we were able to win some of those victories in Brooklyn, but that's the path. 1 in 2 people in Brooklyn are on Medicaid. 1 in 2 people in the Bronx are on Medicaid. There is not one organization in New York State where 7 million people are on Medicaid representing people who are on Medicaid. Not one. That's $72 billion a year of tax of state money goes for Medicaid. There is no voice whatsoever from the people. From the people. That's how far we have to go. If we're talking about building power to take to change the food systems, we really have to start organizing people and awakening people. Last thing, Colombia, you mentioned Colombia, South America. At this point, I don't distinguish working in Colombia from working in Haiti, from working in Bed-Stuy, because to me, I see the same thing everywhere I go. In Colombia, a year ago, I was working and Tatiana, my former student and now works with me in the city. We were in the Amazon, in Putumayo, working in a village where 350 people were crushed by boulders, killed, because they received extraordinarily heavy rains, climate change, which loosened boulders in the surrounding hills, which came down in an avalanche and crushed 350 people, mainly Inca people, indigenous people, who had been forced out of the rainforest by drug dealing and the civil conflict. And then they got killed in the town. And we were there trying to find a safe place for them to rebuild housing. And this is an ongoing project. But we were also trying to work on livelihood for people so they wouldn't burn down the rainforest just to find a way to eke out a living or grow cocaine to survive. And so we were working on projects like that. But one of the things we've been working on in Colombia, we've been working with, there's a cooperative of 2,000 women in the Pacific Coast who grow rice. And they are all people who have been displaced by violence, mainly caused by the mining companies, who forced them off their land so they could do illegal mining. And these women grow rice. They literally pick up cocaine plants that the drug gangs plant and plant rice. They're courageous women, but they're mainly black women. And in black culture, I don't care if you work for a drug gang or whatever, you better not mess with somebody's mama or their grandmama or their aunt. So these women, they're like, even the drug dealers are like, okay, grandma said, you better not mess. But you ask, what can we do as a city? Lots of things, beginning with empowering people to make decisions over how things happen in city government. But one thing we can do is buy their rights. So that's one of the projects that I want to do. I want us to start as a city using our procurement power to actually help empower folks in the Caribbean, in Central America, who are trying to build different kinds of lives. And why not? We don't grow rice in New York City. We don't grow coffee in New York City. We have 3.8 million immigrants who come from the Caribbean and Central America and other places. So why don't we build a shared economy together? Why don't we work together to learn how to empower people and give them voice in the economy together? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Wonderful start to our conversation. Our next speaker is Mark Winnie, who probably knows as much about food policy councils as anyone in the United States. And the questions I'm hoping you'll have something to say about are, what are some of the ways that food policy councils contribute to food democracy here in this country? And what are some obstacles they encounter in seeking to more fully engage sectors of the population that aren't always included in making food policy? Thanks.
All right, good morning, everybody. I guess I don't have to warm you up. The deputy mayor did that. So I'll get rid of that. But thank you for having me. It's good to see Nick again, and Nevin, and nice to meet Rosita, and Jan Poppendike's a colleague that I've mine for a very long time. She's not here today. So I spent 25 to 30 years in Hartford, Connecticut. It gave me a lot of time to come to New York. I grew up in North Jersey. So I'm just trying to, like a good politician, claim some roots in this place where I'm speaking. Naturally, that made me an expert in everything New York, having this sort of tangential connection to this. But I have had a good opportunity, kind of at a survey level, to know what's going on, learn a little bit about what the New York City food system looks like and feels like and what the challenges are. But now I live in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and that's not exactly a hardship, but it's something that's given me a different perspective. And as per today, as the New Mexico cowboys like to say, I'm going to tell the truth, but I'm going to ride a fast horse. I'm going to be leaving town tomorrow. So what I'm going to say is, food democracy is not yet a reality. We have a long way to go. We have some huge challenges. And I have been working in the Food Policy Council arena, you might say, along with other food system work at neighborhood levels. Am I getting like feedback here? Turn.
Pushing the second microphone over to the side.
That one. Okay, I don't see if that, does that, you still hear me?
Okay, now.
Okay, good. So I've been working with food policy councils for a long time. I do work with Johns Hopkins University at the Center for a Livable Future, where, among other things, we just finished a survey of food policy councils in the U.S. and Canada, excuse me. One thing I'll note from this slide is the website that below is we have a tremendous amount of material on food systems, food policy councils, urban food systems, so you can probably find many different references if you're looking for them there. So I want to look at, I see food policy councils as one vehicle toward food democracy. It has many challenges, as I said. I think there's perhaps some flaws in the model. I think there's also opportunities for improvement. But I also think that there's certain aspects of food systems that we need to understand before we sort of launch ourselves in the direction of what we're calling food democracy. Just quickly, this is what food policy councils tend to look like in terms of what they do. And I also should say another thing about the name Food Policy Council isn't necessarily the best name, but it's the one that we've been using for a while. You'll find many places that are using just Food Council or Food Systems Network or some other variation on that. So I'm going to, for the purposes of this discussion, I'm going to keep referring to them as food policy councils. Most of them do some kind of policy work, but not all of them. But this gives you a general idea of from planning to being the voice for the community and engaging directly with policymakers. This is pretty much what food policy councils are about. Now, I referred to a survey that we did. It just was released. You may be the first to be seeing some of the results here. I'm not sure, but I'm going to give you a quick review of what we found and what we know about the world of food policy councils right now. These are the numbers. The top number are the combined food policy councils in Canada and the U.S., including about 5 or 6 from tribal communities in North America. The thing that's, I think, most notable here is the rapid growth from about 10 years ago, really about a 6-fold increase in the number of food policy councils in North America, but 284 altogether in the United States. They're not that old. They're really still children. I think it's like 15% of all the food policy councils are more than 10 years old. This has always been interesting to me because ever since I've been involved with food policy councils for a very long time, and I'd always have graduate students calling me up and say, I want to do an evaluation of food policy councils. I'd be getting one or two of those every month. I said, there's not that many, and they haven't been around that long, but they still wanted to evaluate them. So it's still a very new area, and it's still one that we don't actually know a lot about, but I think, thankfully, we're applying some more resources and institutional capacity to understand what makes them work. But you can see they're still quite new on the horizon. Looking at their relationship to government, this is always a big question about food policy councils. How close are they to government? It's interesting that in the east and the northeast part of the country, people tend to want them to be pretty close to government, if not actually a part of government. If I go further west, they don't want to have anything to do with government. And so they're they want to be completely on their own. They don't like the government if you continue going west. So there's a certain amount of tension around that. However, the thing we find is that if they're going to be effective, they have to have some kind of relationship to government. And you actually find that increasingly they are finding, if they're not a part of government, they are finding ways to actually work with government. And their membership, here you can see kind of a smattering of what it looks like, but the largest category is coming from the community, or rather the largest number of food policy councils who make community members a part of their food policy councils is apparent. We see other groups such as labor, social justice organizations, and youth that are increasingly represented. It's not just you know, the skilled professionals, people who make their living from food system kinds of work or food sector areas. It's from a much wider community. I once had a person at a conference say, about 5 or 6 years ago, who I had respected until she made this comment, that food policy councils are controlled by chambers of commerce. I had never met a food policy council that even had a member of the Chamber of Commerce on them. And I certainly wouldn't be a part of one if it did, but not that I actually have a few friends who are members of the Chamber of Commerce. But there is a lot of sort of misunderstanding and misinformation I find about the food policy council world. What about organizational priorities? If you think about what is the process, how do we go about doing our work? This becomes our organizational priorities. And as we looked at the food policy councils, we found that community community engagement was again the #1 area of concern. Inclusion and diversity was also fairly important, though not as high as we thought it might be. And so, but increasingly, this is the discussion I have with food policy councils around the country. They want to know, how do we speak for the community? How is the community involved? How do we represent the issues and concerns that the community has? And it is a struggle, but it is certainly at the top of the list of food policy council work. Community engagement. A lot of activity, a lot of the work we've been doing recently at Center for a Livable Future is around how do we come up with good community engagement activities? What are some of the things that we can do? And so some of what I know this is probably impossible, you have to stand on your head to read it, but you know, there's a lot of sort of partnering that goes on within the food policy councils with other groups. There is a lot of hosting of community events and forums and hearings and discussions, summits. Almost every place I've been, every group that I've worked with has some kind of organized effort going on to reach out to the community and to engage, work with the community. But you know, we're still learning. We're still trying to figure out how to do that better. What's their commitment to, or how well does the membership of the council represent the racial, economic, and gender diversity of the community? Got a long way to go here. Only about a quarter or so of the food policy councils feel that they are doing that to a great extent or a lot. So still the vast number don't feel that they truly represent the community racially, economically, and gender-wise. Policy priorities as distinct from organizational priorities. What are they doing to try to make a change in the food system? And here's a list. The top ones are healthy food access, economic development, anti-hunger work. And these break down more concretely into a number of other actual specific activities. I'll give you just a few examples. From Kansas City, they improved grocery shopping using the public transportation system by actually securing a bonding issue to provide funding for improved transportation. In the state of Nevada, they came up with $1 million from their legislature to supplement funding for school breakfast. Massachusetts secured $1.3 million for SNAP funding at farmers markets. The city of Worcester, Massachusetts, their food policy council worked with others to raise the minimum wage in Massachusetts to $15 an hour. And we have something we call the Food Policy Council Wheel of Achievement that I couldn't show you here because I just couldn't make it work on a slide, but it shows hundreds of examples of communities and what specifically and concretely what they've done to influence their food system. I'd say the biggest challenge we face right now is money. Every single food policy council has challenges around a budget. This is only a small number really have even something over $25,000 a year. So with all these food policy councils and the growth in food policy councils, the amount of money available is really puny. Other challenges are recruitment and engagement, membership and leadership. I was glad to hear that the point about leadership. I really think that that's a critical issue in all the communities we're working with. We need to spend more time developing people, their capacity to be good leaders. It's not something that comes naturally to everybody. It takes a lot of work. So I'm going to close with a philosophical thought or two here. democracy? Well, I'm sure you're all intimately familiar with the Japanese Buddhist constitution. But I like it. 600 AD, they said decisions on important matters should be made by not just by one person. They should be discussed with many. What better issue than food to have many people involved? And Amartya Sen's research on famine around the world basically showed that famine was not an issue in countries that had a well-developed democracy, free press, and so forth, even if the country was poor. So poverty wasn't necessarily the factor in creating conditions for famine. It was a lack of democracy. So I use that as sort of a basis for why we're trying to make food a topic for food democracy. And but the other thought on this is that I have found from my work that this quote by a mentor of mine, Tom Wolfe, which says, involving grassroots citizens in the work of coalitions and food policy councils are essentially coalitions, is one of the thorniest issues that coalitions will grapple with. Again and again, we hear coalitions bemoan the lack of real citizens and residents as participants in their coalitions' efforts. This is a challenge we all face. This is hard work. And I raise that because as I think about the work that I have done with food over going on 40 plus years at this point, I have to say that the biggest advances, the biggest policy moments, you might say, were due in fact to a number of issues that really didn't involve food democracy. They were often the result of a small number of food policy advocates. The SNAP program, providing over trillions of dollars of food now since its inception, was the result of some politicians and some, just give me one more minute. It was a result of advocates like the Food Research Action Center in Washington, it's FRAC. I think about banning trans fats in New York. I believe that was the action of your health department and Mayor Bloomberg. It wasn't, I don't see that as an act of food democracy. I have many examples in Hartford where I was working where people were able to change, we made changes, but it was a very small number of people who were knowledgeable about city government, knowledgeable about state government, knowledgeable about the issues and the bureaucracies and so forth. They were able to make changes that provided better, healthier, more affordable food to a wider community. And some major change. In my town now, Santa Fe, we had a tax, a vote on, a citywide vote on whether or not to institute equal amount of funding, about $1.5 million for that tax, and about $1.5 million against it. The $1.5 million for the tax came from Michael Bloomberg, and the other half came from the National Beverage Association, that's from the anti-tax people. The anti-tax people won like 60% to 40%. It wasn't even close. A pure form of democracy. The people weighed in. Most of the people, the majority of people from the lower income and Hispanic parts of the city voted against the tax. The people from the higher end, the white, light, bright Anglo part of town voted in favor of the tax. It was a very interesting struggle. So I bring this all to the point that I sometimes see this world as an opportunity cost. How much time am I going to invest in developing the capacity of people to speak for themselves and to become active in food democracy, when I know there can be some really sharp people out there who can make some big changes in the system just because they're either insiders, they have access, they know how things work. Those are the two, I see those as two almost ethical challenges in a way, process challenges about how we secure some bigger moments in food policy. So I'm going to leave that as sort of the question that I hope that we can grapple with later on. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. Our third and final speaker is Katie Parker, who works at the intersection of two really important issues, community democracy and community wealth building. And the questions I'm hoping that you'll be able to speak to are how does community wealth building contribute to local democracy and more equitable distribution of wealth, and in what ways has food contributed to community wealth building? Welcome and thanks for coming.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for having me. My name is Katie Parker, and I'm based at the Democracy Collaborative, which is a research and implementation-focused think tank based in DC, and we are focused on advancing a more just and democratic economy. And I'll speak a little more about how we do that, but first, just excited to say I'm excited to be here because my entry to this economic justice work was really through the lens of food systems. I worked on a bunch of farms and kind of looked at university procurement and farmland preservation in my studies, and you'll hear that thinking about how to leverage procurement and thinking about ownership of assets like land is a big part of what we do at the Democracy Collaborative. So as Nick shared, these are the questions that I'm hoping to talk about. So first off, a definition of community wealth building, which is the framework for economic development that we are working on at the Democracy Collaborative. And we define community wealth building as a systems approach to economic development that creates an inclusive economy built on local and broad-based ownership. A couple words in there I want to pull out. The first is systems approach. So we're interested in shifting the paradigm of economic development so that inclusion and equity aren't just afterthoughts that you can do with whatever economic growth, but it's actually baked into the system. The other element of that is recognizing that current economic development is pretty extractive and often relies on extracting wealth from particularly communities of color. So when we're thinking of building systems for wealth building, really centering that and changing our current wealth building structures, which are designed to benefit very few people. The other word in here I want to talk about is broad-based ownership. So we're talking about structures that actually shift control over and access to resources. So things like worker-owned cooperatives, community land trusts, credit unions, where you're taking the resource in question and putting it in the hands of residents. We talk about 7 drivers of community wealth building. Place, so the idea that you're cultivating local assets instead of relying on attracting outside businesses. Ownership, which I just talked about. Multipliers, so thinking how to leverage the economic activity that's already happening with large anchor institutions like universities and hospitals to build economic development. Collaboration, so bringing maybe some unlikely partners to the table in economic development work. Focusing on workforce and jobs, and particularly for residents who are facing barriers to employment. Equity and inclusion, so again, really centering people who have been excluded from economic development, and that systems approach of changing the results of economic development. So rather than kind of traditional corporate attraction strategies, we're thinking about how to bring in community voice and ownership throughout the process. A big part of my research at the Democracy Collaborative has been focusing on the role of anchor institutions, so universities, hospitals, city government, other large nonprofit or public institutions, and thinking through how they can bring their business assets to support this type of work. So things like procuring with locally owned businesses, thinking about their own hiring policies, and thinking about their investment capacity through endowments. And I've done a lot of work with hospitals and health systems around this, so you'll hear those examples kind of come to the forefront. So one project that the Democracy Collaborative is known for is our collaboration in what we call the Cleveland model. So in Cleveland, Ohio, there's a set of worker-owned cooperatives that were established to kind of meet the supply chain needs of the local universities and hospitals. And so residents who were unable to get jobs at the local health systems because of barriers around histories of incarceration are now able to become worker owners at these businesses that supply things for local anchors and an increasing customer base. And I'll talk more about that in a bit. Where I see a lot of alignment between community wealth building and food are kind of 2 areas. One is thinking about about the growth of cooperative enterprise within food systems, so looking at worker-owned businesses focused on food production and food entrepreneurship, thinking about producer cooperatives, so what are instances where shared ownership over infrastructure and resources and distribution channels can create greater equity, and thinking about consumer cooperatives, so the growth of the food co-op movement and how can we use that as a tool to build a more just and resilient food system. And then through all of that, how can anchor institutions support that with their resources? And we're seeing a lot of movement with health systems because there's an interest in healthier, more affordable food, and as well as kind of thinking about food systems as systems and thinking about the economic development of a whole region. So the first example is going back to Cleveland. So one of the cooperatives that was established is called Green City Growers, and it's the largest indoor greenhouse in Northeast Ohio, and they specialize in microgreens. So there was a want to get more fresh greens in the hospital cafeterias, but now they have a wide customer base. And the really cool thing here is that workers at the greenhouse actually own a stake in the company, so it's one member, one vote. So not only do they get greater access to wealth building through profit sharing, but should any big decisions about relocation come up, workers have a say and are at the table. Another example I really like is in Toledo, Ohio. This is through a partnership at ProMedica, which is a hospital in Toledo. And they kind of went to the community and they were like, okay, we're going to address the obesity epidemic. And community members were kind of like, you know, the real issue for us is food insecurity and hunger. And for you to be talking to us about obesity isn't really useful. So they kind of went back to the drawing board and started to do a lot around food insecurity. And what they really came down to was it was an issue of jobs and economic security. So they started it's kind of a multi-use building that has financial services as well as some clinic services. But there was also the issue that no grocers wanted to locate to that area of Toledo, Ohio. So they actually own a grocery store that's operating, and they've connected it to workforce development and training opportunities for local residents. So it's not only serving their kind of clinical side of increasing access to healthy food, but also providing economic development. Another example we like to hold up is the Hmong American Farmers Association in the Twin Cities. So they've done a lot of work around supporting technical assistance for farmers, as well as for serving as a sort of producer cooperative where they're able to aggregate the produce from a lot of small farmers and then gain contracts with the area anchor institutions. So Fairview Health East is a hospital operating in the Twin Cities, and they recently launched a veggie pharmacy program, and they're actually contracting with the Hmong American Farmers Association for those vegetables. So it's not only, again, reaching their health needs, but also thinking about economic development. And the last example I want to talk about is Fifth Season Cooperative, which is a multi-stakeholder cooperative. So that means that there's a lot of different groups that have an ownership stake. So it's not only the producers, but also folks at the anchor institutions who are buying the food, as well as food workers. And so since all those different groups have a say at the table related to business decisions, they're able to set a pretty robust set of priorities around economic development and sustainability. So where I get really excited thinking about community wealth building and food systems is thinking through worker ownership. So how throughout the whole food system for food systems workers, starting at farmers, going to distributors, going to kind of the like value-added food products, what are opportunities for cooperative enterprise? And I think New York City is a great example of where there has been public investment in thinking through worker cooperatives, and so ensuring that food policy decisions and procurement decisions are in conversation with those other areas of economic development. I like to nerd out around land and property stuff, so something I'm really interested in is kind of alternative land ownership models, be it with farmland, ensuring access to affordable farmland, but also with community land trusts, which are designed to provide permanently affordable housing. which I think is really important for food security. How can, in those conversations around land and housing, bringing that lens of how this can help to build a more resilient food system. Another area is make multi-stakeholder cooperatives, so like that last example of fifth season cooperative, how can you make sure that the wide array of people affected by food systems decisions are at the table? So linking perhaps like food co-ops that are consumer-driven with worker-owned cooperatives, with producer cooperatives, and thinking about innovative models where the people who should be at the table have a say in decision-making. And lastly, thinking through finance. A big part of all of the projects I talked about was access to capital, be it leveraging various federal tax credit programs, getting philanthropic support. So thinking through what are the ways that we can finance this, and that's an area of research we're working on at the Democracy Collaborative, thinking through if you're a university with an endowment or a health system which with a large investment portfolio, how can you begin to move your money to the institutions like community development, financial institutions, or credit unions that are doing some of this really important work and building out more models for that. And that's it. So looking forward to more discussions.
What a provocative panel. So one of our goals for this forum is to begin a discussion within the organizations doing food work in New York City and among food analysts, activists, a discussion of food democracy and what do we do tomorrow and next week and next year to build up and strengthen. And so we're going to move into another phase of this discussion. At the small tables, the speakers are going to distribute themselves at the tables, and some of our staff will be at each table. And we want to have a more intimate discussion around food democracy, and we'll do that for about the next half hour or so. And let me again remind you to please fill out your survey and give it to one of our staff or put it on the table before you leave. So if people could take the speakers could take their seats at the table, and we'll spend some time talking to each other about food democracy.